Hey, it's Matt. I'm out in the backyard, and as soon as I walked back here and got set up, I crunched on this thing, causing me to realize that the backyard here is also the back end of my neighbor's archery range. So I have two objectives with this video knowing that. One, don't get murdered by my neighbor. Two, talk about how the church went from being one group of 120 people in a single location to 2,000 years later being a group of 2.1 billion people spread out over thousands and thousands of different expressions of Christian faith. So this is the lightning version of that story. Christianity's been a diverse religion from the get-go. Within a generation of Christ, you have faith happening in Europe, Africa, and Asia, and eventually it's the European version that sort of wins out. Latin Christianity, or Roman Catholicism as we call it, is ascendant by the 3rd or 4th century. And that's aided by the fact that the Roman emperors moved the seat of government of the Roman Empire east to modern-day Istanbul, and then asked the popes in Rome kind of prop things up and manage the farm back out west. Well, as the European kingdoms emerged through the second half of the first millennium, all of those kings start to become more and more dependent on the authority of the Pope to hold up their own authority. As all of this is going on, Eastern Orthodox Church in modern-day Istanbul, where they speak Greek and do things differently and worship differently, is becoming more and more distant from the Roman Church out west. And eventually the thing comes to a head in 1054 AD when the Western Church out and out excommunicates the entire Eastern Church. They took that really personally, and the two sides haven't completely patched it up since. These two main expressions of Christianity evolve further apart during the Crusades as they get into it militarily while theoretically they're fighting against the Muslims. And by the time we roll around to the early 1500s, we've seen the world change a lot. We've gone through a Renaissance. People think about art and life and humanity and God a little bit differently. The Bible is starting to be translated into languages that people actually speak instead of Latin, which has been long since dead. And along comes a German monk named Martin Luther. He gets crossways with the Catholic Church and the Protestant Reformation is underway. What I mean by Protestant are those churches that split off from the Catholic Church starting in 1500. Well, there are a bunch more. In Switzerland, you've got a guy named Zwingli, followed by a guy named Calvin. Both of them have interaction with a group of Christians who see things differently on the question of baptism. And now you've got 4 Protestant groups. Not long after that, the Brits go through their Reformation, and now you've got 5 Protestant groups. Not long after that, the Reformers make their way to Scotland, and now you've got 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and it just takes off. Protestantism spider webs like a broken windshield, and so tension emerges between all of these different groups, but mostly they're unified and fighting against the Catholics, sometimes with words, sometimes with swords. It's a pretty ugly time in the history of Europe, and there's a lot on the line. People are really doing battle theologically during this time, and it's a time where people are prepared to part ways with other Christians over theological differences that we, looking back from today, might find to be trivial, but to them were a huge deal. The division amongst Protestants and between Protestants and Catholics gets so deep that some people are even willing to pack up their stuff and move somewhere that's completely unexplored to try to live out their faith in a way that's in keeping with their conscience. These colonial churches take on a new flavor that's distinctly American. Eventually, you've got the missionary efforts of both Jesuit Catholics and Protestant missionaries all over the world, and as the gospel comes into these different places, we see new hybrid expressions of Christianity emerging. By the time we get into the 20th century, suffice it to say the church is incredibly diverse. Some of that diversity was a result of awful, violent fighting, but most of that diversity was in the spirit of agree to disagree and let's just go our separate ways so that we can worship with a clean conscience. So there's the blazing fast version of a very enormous, complex story. I have friends who have a huge problem with this story. They look at it and say, that's my gripe with Christianity. It seems dumb and fake because there's so many different versions of it, and how can you even know which one is right, even if any of it was right in the first place? I get the gripe, I just don't share it. I am at ease with this. Of course, Christian history is not pretty or perfect, but God said that he would stick with his church, and the church has screwed a bunch of stuff up itself, and the church has had to endure some pretty tough things from the outside. Both situations, God seems to have been true to his word and stuck with them. Additionally, church has always been about taking the message of God to people who are different, don't think the same way or look the same way or come at the world the same way. If you take this message all around the world, you're going to run into different people, and that means that their expressions of Christianity are going to be different. The fact that there are lots of different expressions says to me that this hasn't been a country club kind of religion. It's been for everybody all along, and that diversity shouldn't be a threat. Third, I like the fact that different churches exist because then you can go to church in the place that makes sense for you. You don't have to think the exact same thing as everybody else who professes Christ. I like the fact that I can go to church with people who come at it pretty much like me, but that I can also root from a distance for people who don't come at it exactly like me. Don't need to fight about every single thing. God can sort it out, and it's cool that we have this diversity within the church. That was a lot. Hopefully you're not feeling too overwhelmed, and this gives you a good starting point for knowing more about this enormous story. We'll have plenty more opportunities to talk about it, and you can always dig into it on your own. I'm Matt Whitman. This is a more to think about episode of the 10-Minute Bible Hour. We'll catch you soon.